He started with one borrowed boat. By the time he died, Cornelius Vanderbilt controlled an empire worth over $100 million, and his name struck fear into the heart of American business. But what began with ruthless ambition didn't end in triumph. Within 2 generations, the greatest private fortune in U.S. history dissolved into scandal, excess, and public disgrace. So, how did unimaginable wealth become a cautionary tale almost overnight? The answer begins on a stormy stretch of the Hudson River. Cornelius Vanderbilt was just a boy when he first steered a Perry Auger, a flat-bottomed ferry boat, across the rough currents between Staten Island and Manhattan. The year was 1794. New York Harbor already teemed with ferries, but Vanderbilt was determined to carve out a place for himself. He borrowed $100 from his mother to get started, gambling on the idea that grit and relentless effort could outpace the established operators. The Hudson River's tides and unpredictable weather were constant threats, but so were the cutthroat tactics of rival ferrymen. Vanderbilt's first move was simple but radical. He slashed fares. Where competitors charged up to $4 for a crossing, he sometimes charged only $1, sometimes less. Passengers flocked to his boat, and soon his Perry Auger was running full, while others sat idle at the docks. The low fares squeezed his margins, but crushed his rivals. Many simply gave up, selling their boats or paying Vanderbilt to stay off the water. By the 1820s, he had expanded from a single ferry to a small fleet, reinvesting every dollar into faster boats and more routes. The real turning point came after the Supreme Court's Gibbons-Ogden decision in 1824, which broke the old state-controlled monopoly over steamboat traffic on the Hudson. Vanderbilt seized the opening, launching steamships up and down the river. He undercut every established line, sometimes running boats at a loss just to force others out. By the 1840s, his fleet numbered over 100 ships, and local ledgers showed Hudson River freight rates dropping by nearly a third. Vanderbilt's reputation grew as someone who wouldn't back down, no matter how fierce the competition. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a force. Port records from the era list his name beside every major shipping line from New York to Albany. By the time he turned 40, Vanderbilt had forced so many rivals out that shippers and passengers alike had little choice but to use his boats. What began as a teenage gamble on a stormy river had grown into the first hints of a monopoly, built on relentless fare wars and a willingness to outwork, outspend, and outlast anyone in his way. By the early 1850s, Cornelius Vanderbilt's name had become a warning to anyone who dared compete on the water or the rails. In 1853, a new round of fare wars erupted along the Hudson River. Vanderbilt dropped ticket prices to just 12.5 cents, less than the cost of a loaf of bread. Rivals scrambled to match his prices, but few lasted long. Within months, entire companies collapsed. Newspapers ran headlines calling him the terror of the rails, and editorials accused him of ruining honest men and driving families into poverty. Competitors who tried to hold out found themselves facing relentless schedules and empty seats. Freight lines reported losses so steep that one by one they sold out or shut down. The Stonington Railroad, once a major player, was forced into bankruptcy after Vanderbilt undercut their fares and siphoned away their customers. At the docks, laid-off workers gathered in search of new jobs, while former owners watched their fortunes disappear overnight. The public response was divided. Some hailed the cheap fares, grateful for a chance to travel further than ever before. But for many, Vanderbilt's tactics felt like a threat. Editorial cartoons painted him as a greedy giant, stomping on small businesses. The press accused him of caring nothing for the communities his line served, only for the profits he could extract. Letters to the editor warned that one man's unchecked power could hold entire cities hostage. Vanderbilt ignored the backlash. He bought out bankrupt rivals at bargain prices, then raised fares again once the competition was gone. His control over the Hudson River and, soon after, the railroads left little room for dissent. Even city leaders who once welcomed his investments now spoke of him with unease. The message was clear. Vanderbilt had built his empire not on trust or goodwill, but on the ruthless elimination of anyone who stood in his way. The fear and resentment swirling around Vanderbilt's name would haunt his heirs for decades. As the family's fortune grew, so did the challenge of turning raw power into lasting respect. For Cornelius, though, respect was never the goal. Monopoly was the only prize worth winning. William Henry Vanderbilt inherited a fortune that dwarfed anything America had seen. But in the eyes of New York's elite, money alone wasn't enough. The Vanderbilt name, built on aggressive business and public resentment, faced a wall of closed doors. William Henry's drive to be accepted among the city's old guard collided with a reputation shaped by his father's ruthless tactics. The clash came into focus in 1879, when a reporter pressed William about running trains for public convenience instead of profit. His answer, "The public be damned," was splashed across headlines and lampooned in editorial cartoons. The phrase stuck, haunting the family and confirming the suspicion that the Vanderbilts cared only for themselves. Letters between family members show concern over the backlash, and the press turned up the heat, painting the heirs as out of touch with the world beyond their mansions. Desperate to rewrite the narrative, William Henry turned to culture and charity. He poured money into the arts, underwriting the Metropolitan Opera and funding music halls. Ledgers from the era list thousands spent each season to keep the opera afloat, with the family's name printed in every program. But these gestures, however grand, often felt transactional, an attempt to buy legitimacy that old money families inherited by birth. The family's philanthropic efforts reached beyond the stage. In 1873, William gave $1 million to establish Vanderbilt University in Nashville, a move that signaled a new ambition to tie the family name to learning and progress. The university's founding charter named William as its chief benefactor, and the endowment would eventually grow into one of the largest in the South. Still, for many in New York, the gesture was seen as an attempt to buy respect at a distance, rather than mend fences at home. Inside the family, the pressure to impress grew heavier. William's sons, especially Cornelius too, took up the challenge, investing in even more elaborate displays of wealth. Architects and designers were summoned to create homes and public spaces that would outshine anything seen before. The stage was set for a new kind of competition, one fought not on the rails, but in marble, stained glass, and acres of manicured lawns. The quest for social acceptance had become an arms race of architecture, with the next generation determined to build their way into history. George Washington Vanderbilt II was not content to merely inherit a fortune. He set out to create a monument that would outshine every rival estate in America. In 1989, he broke ground on Biltmore, a project so ambitious that it drew the best minds and craftsmen of the era. Architect Richard Morris Hunt designed the mansion, inspired by French chateaux, but scaled up to a level never before seen on U.S. soil. The final structure sprawled across 178,926 square feet, with over 250 rooms, 65 fireplaces, and a banquet hall large enough to swallow most city homes whole. Construction swarmed with more than 2,000 workers at its peak. Stone was hauled in from nearby quarries, and a private railway line was built just to shuttle materials to the site. The estate's grounds, orchestrated by Frederick Law Olmsted, stretched over 125,000 acres, an engineered landscape of forests, gardens, and farmland. Every detail was designed to impress: indoor plumbing, electric lighting, and a massive library lined with rare volumes. The cost to build Biltmore surged to $6 million by the time it opened in 1895, roughly $200 million today. To announce its completion, George hosted a gala for 1,000 guests, filling the halls with the city's elite European nobility and the nation's most powerful families. Servants in formal livery attended to every whim, while orchestras played beneath ceilings painted to mimic the sky. The press marveled at the spectacle, but whispers of extravagance soon spread beyond the velvet ropes. Maintaining Biltmore required an army. Records from the early years list more than 2,000 staff on the payroll, from gardeners and cooks to blacksmiths and dairy hands. Annual upkeep by 1910 reached $800,000, an amount that could have funded entire city blocks in New York. Every year, these costs climbed, even as the family's railroad dividends began to slow. Biltmore was never just a home. It was a declaration. The Vanderbilts had arrived, and their wealth could build a world apart. But with every new wing and every hired hand, the estate's appetite grew. The fortune that once seemed limitless now faced a burden of its own making, as the cost of grandeur threatened to outpace even the deepest pockets. In 1913, the rules of wealth in America changed overnight. The ratification of the 16th Amendment brought federal income tax to the nation for the first time, with a top rate of 7% for the largest fortunes. The Vanderbilts, who had built their empire on untaxed dividends and inheritances, suddenly faced a new and relentless collector, the Internal Revenue Service. By 1915, estate taxes followed, targeting the transfer of wealth from one generation to the next. The numbers were staggering. When George Washington Vanderbilt II died in 1914, his estate triggered a tax bill of nearly $11 million, money that had to be paid in cash, not in railroad shares or priceless artwork. Family council minutes from that year show the panic spreading among trustees. The annual costs of maintaining Biltmore and the other estates already strained the family's resources, but the new tax laws demanded immediate liquidity. Trustees debated which assets to sell first: art collections, railroad stock, or entire properties. Some argued for consolidating holdings to preserve what remained, but rival branches refused. The old unity was gone, replaced by arguments over whose mansion would be sacrificed and who would bear the brunt of the tax burden. IRS filings from this period reveal the breadth of the damage. Vanderbilt heirs, once insulated from public scrutiny, now submitted detailed inventories of every asset: oil paintings, silver, furniture, bonds, and real estate. The government's share came off the top, slicing away at the fortune before heirs could claim their inheritance. The top tax bracket hit the richest families hardest, and the Vanderbilts were near the very top. Liquidation was the only answer. Railroad shares were dumped on the market, sometimes at a loss, to raise the cash needed for taxes. Priceless art left the family's galleries for the auction block. Behind closed doors, the family council grew tense, with accusations and blame replacing the easy confidence of earlier years. The era of unchecked Vanderbilt wealth was over. The taxman's arrival forced a reckoning that no palace or legacy could prevent. By the end of the 1920s, the Vanderbilt fortune was already battled by taxes and family division. Then the Great Depression swept away what remained of their financial security. The flow of railroad dividends and rental income dried up almost overnight, but the bills for their palaces kept coming. Staff who once filled the halls of Biltmore, gardeners, cooks, maids, and stable hands, found themselves dismissed in waves. Payroll records from 1929 show more than 1,600 workers on the estate. By 1930, fewer than 100 remained. The silence in the corridors was broken only by the echo of empty footsteps. Desperation forced the family to do the unthinkable. Biltmore, once a private kingdom, opened its doors to the public in March 1930. Admission cost just $1. For the price of a simple meal, anyone could wander through halls that had once hosted royalty and tycoons. The irony was sharp. A house built to keep the world out now relied on strangers to pay its bills. Local papers ran the story with a mix of awe and disbelief. Within months, the estate welcomed thousands of visitors, their curiosity feeding a new kind of survival. The changes went far beyond Biltmore. Other Vanderbilt mansions, too expensive to keep, began to disappear from family ledgers. In 1932, the Breakers in Newport, once the summer playground of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, was sold to the Preservation Society for a fraction of its original cost. The sale was quiet, almost secretive, as if the family wished to erase the memory of its own retreat. Furniture, art, and silver left the auction block in a steady trickle. In 1934, priceless paintings and sculptures from the family's collection were donated to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. The gesture was framed as philanthropy, but the tax write-off was essential. Through these years, the Vanderbilt name lost its grip on privacy and power. The estates that had stood as monuments to exclusivity became public attractions, relics of a vanished era. What began as a fortress against the world ended as a ticketed tour. Each new visitor, each shuttered room, locked in the reality that America's richest family had become a chapter in someone else's story. Today, the Vanderbilt mansions stand as reminders. Even the greatest fortunes can vanish in a generation. In the United States, over 70% of family wealth disappears by the third generation. In an era of record inequality, the lesson endures. Wealth without purpose or structure is only temporary. Legacy endures by what they build, not just by what they own.